Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be telling you about some of my favourite books that I read in 2024. So this is going to be the first of two sort of best books of the year videos. So today I'm going to talk about all my favourite modern books that I read in 2024, you know, books mostly from the 21st century. I think there's maybe one from the 90s. And then I'm also going to do a favourite classics video, probably early next week. So I have lots of books to talk to you about today, lots of wonderful favourites of the year. And as I did last year, I've separated these into some categories. So we're going to start off with some poetry, some short stories, some non-fiction, and then I'm going to move into the novels that I loved in 2024. So I will start off with my favourite two poetry collections of the year, both of which were wonderful. So I absolutely loved Bright Feir by Mary Jean Chan. This is a fantastic, wonderful collection of poetry, some more traditional poems, some more sort of prose poetry, and I just love the way Mary Jean Chan writes. I think they're a fantastic, really talented poet, and I think this is a really accessible poetry collection for people who are newer to poetry. Like, I got a lot out of every poem in this collection. Mary Jean Chan explores themes of identity and belonging and family, and it's such a fantastic collection. And then another collection that I also loved this year is Serious Concerns by Wendy Cope. This is the book from the 90s. I think this came out in 1992, and this is a really fun, witty collection of entertaining poems. There are a few more serious poems in here, but a lot of the poems are very comic, and I just love the way Wendy Cope writes. Her poems are just such a pleasure to read, and they always make me laugh. So I really enjoyed this collection a lot as well. I do also have a favourite collection of short stories that I read in 2024, and that is this. This is The Winter Spirits, Ghostly Tales for Frosty Nights. So this is a short story anthology published by Feir, which consists of lots of short stories by a lot of historical fiction writers. This was published a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed this collection. As always with a short story anthology, with stories written by different people, there were some stories I loved more than others. There were definitely a few stories that I didn't like in here, but overall I thought the collection was really strong with a lot of fantastic stories in, and some of the stories in here were so amazing that I really wanted to mention it in my favourite books of the year video. I think my two favourite, like, absolute standout stories in the collection were The Salt Miracles by Natasha Pulley and Ada Lark by Jess Kidd, but there were so many other wonderful stories in it too. A Double Thread by Imogen Hoeyes-Gower was great. Inferno by Laura Sheffer-Robinson was great. Host by Kieran Morwood-Hargrave was great. Jenkins by Katrina Ward was great. It was just a really strong collection, and one I definitely recommend. Then I also have a favourite comic of 2024. I mean, I only actually read one comic and one graphic novel in 2024, but I just loved Hawk Girl, Once Upon a Galaxy so much that I thought I would mention it in my favourite books of the year video, and reading this was just such a joy and made me really want to read more comics in the future. This is a really fun comic about Hawk Girl and another superhero called Galaxy, and they are kind of teaming up to fight against an enemy who is going back in time and changing people's lives, and kind of affecting how they are in the future. And it was just really good fun and such an utter pleasure to read. So yes, definitely want to be reading more comics in 2025. Then there have been three non-fiction books I read in 2024 that were real standouts for me that I wanted to mention. One was Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune by Rory Muir, which is basically about the younger sons of the gentry in the Georgian period, but really it's kind of a history of, like, professions and of a certain kind of work that goes through chapters on the Navy, the Army, the civil service, being a lawyer, being a doctor, being a clergyman, and there was just so much in it that was fascinating and really enriching. It's just the kind of social history that I love, with a real nice blend of, like, looking at overarching socioeconomic trends and also the specific lives of individuals, and it was just a really great read. So if anyone is interested in Jane Austen's time period, in the Georgian period, kind of the late 18th, early 19th century, then Gentlemen of Uncertain Fortune is really worth a read. I also really loved Empire Land by Satnam Singera. This is a fantastic non-fiction work, kind of a mix of history and journalism, I suppose, looking at the history of the British Empire and how that history and its legacy has kind of shaped modern Britain. It's a really fantastic, powerful, thought-provoking book, one that I would really recommend to everybody, but especially if you live in the UK. I feel like Empire Land is just such a crucial, fascinating read, and I just thought it was really, really good, as well as being a very accessible non-fiction. So that's another one I would really recommend, another highlight of 2024. And then finally, for my non-fiction favourites in 2024, I also wanted to mention Agens in Britain, 400 Years of History by Rosina Visram. This is a fantastic history book looking at the 17th century to the 20th century, looking at the history of people from the Indian subcontinent coming to Britain, what the lives of these people were like, what the lives of their descendants were like, and it's just a really fantastic history book. Again, has that thing I love in history books where it has a lot of, you know, examination of the big overarching things, but also looks at a lot of individuals and their life stories in a really fascinating way. This is definitely a less accessible book than the other two non-fiction books I just mentioned. This is a more academic history book, but I did think it was fantastic, and it was a really interesting read that also like inspired a lot of my other reading this year. So I feel like it definitely belongs in my favourite books of 2024. Moving now into novels, and again I have sort of separated novels into a few different categories. There will be a proper like fully ranked list of my favourite historical fiction of the year, but I'm finding it harder and harder to sort of compare different kinds of books against each other, and there were so many amazing books I read this year that I thought I would separate things out a little bit. So I read some really wonderful books this year for younger readers, one of which was A Drama and Danger, which is the first book in the Lizzie and Belle mysteries by J.T. Williams. This is a fantastic historical middle grade mystery set in the Georgian period about two young girls who are based on real historical figures, Dido Bell and Lizzie Sancho. In this book, Lizzie and Belle kind of team up to solve not exactly a murder mystery, but an attempted murder mystery when there has been an attempt on the life of Lizzie's father. It's just such a wonderful book, and I feel like not only was it a really fun mystery, but I also feel like the sort of social historical context given was really, really interesting, and I feel like it would be such a valuable read to any young people, as well as being something that I just really enjoyed myself. So I really wanted to recommend that one. And then I also really loved TheTwelve by Liz Hyder. TheTwelve is such a wonderful book. We're following Kit, a young teenage girl who's away on holiday with her family when her sister vanishes, and no one can remember her sister. Even her mum has forgotten that her sister ever existed. The only person that remembers her sister is Kit herself and another boy in the place where they're on holiday, who's called Story. And Kit and Story kind of team up to try and find out what happened to her sister and run into various magical things along the way. Liz Hyder just writes fantastically. I love her books. I've worked on some of her adult fiction before as an editor, and I just think she's such a fantastic writer. And TheTwelve is a wonderful novel. It's one of those books that both like feels like a classic and also feels really fresh, and I just loved it a lot. Also, this year I've been reading Susan Cooper's The Dark is Rising series. I've read the first two books, one of which I will talk about in my favourite classics video. So I think if you really like Susan Cooper, or if you enjoyed Susan Cooper's books when you were a kid, then I think you'll really love TheTwelve as well. And then I also had to mention Gren and Art I'm Not in Love by Lex Croucher, which is a fantastic YA historical novel that was just such an utter joy to read. So actually, as with Liz Hyder, I have worked on some of Lex's adult fiction before as an editor, and when you have worked on someone's books as an editor, like, you're always extra invested in their writing career, I suppose. This book is set in the medieval period, and it's about two young people, Gwendolen and Arthur. They're in their late teens, and they have been betrothed for a long time, but they really hate each other. And they're definitely not in love. Gwendolen has quite a large crush on the only female knight in the kingdom, and Arthur may or may not be far more interested in Gwendolen's brother than he is in Gwendolen. And I just loved so many things about this book. There are definitely a lot of like love story elements to it, but I think what I loved most was sort of the friendship story, and Gwen and Art's like enemies to friends story was just such a joy, because this is a book about like medieval court politics, but it's also a book about two young queer people like helping each other understand themselves better in such a lovely, wonderful, joyous way. And also the medieval court politics is fantastic, and the ending of this book was not what I expected at all, and so good. And I I just love this book so much. Everyone should go and read this, and I need to read more historical YA. There are 3 authors who I've read multiple books from this year, and I couldn't decide which of their books to feature in this video, so I thought I would just talk about those authors in general. One of those authors is Emily Henry, a wonderful writer of fantastic romance novels. This year I read Book Lovers, Happy Place and Beach Read, all of which I absolutely loved. I don't know how I would pick a favourite from them. I think my favourite book by her is still You and Me on Vacation, or People We Meet on Vacation, but I kind of think it's my favourite in the way that, like, a first book you read by a new favourite author kind of becomes your favourite because that was when you were first introduced to their writing. The 3 books I read by Emily Henry this year, Book Lovers, Happy Place and Beach Read, I just really, really enjoyed all of them. I think Emily Henry is such a wonderful writer of romance novels because she has the exact balance I want of the love story and everything else going on. There's always so much else going on in her books. The side characters are always really well developed and the themes are always really, really well developed. And I don't know, I sometimes hear people say that, like, you have to read literary fiction if you want to, like, read about truths about the human condition. But I personally feel like I learned a lot more about the human condition from reading Emily Henry than I do from reading plenty of literary fiction. I just love all of her books so much, and I think she's fantastic, and I really enjoyed everything I've read from her this year. Happy Place is a kind of like second chance love story. Book Lovers is a story about sisters and also about an editor and a literary agent falling in love, and it's about books and about small towns versus the city and so much more. Beach Read is a story of a writer with writer's block falling for another writer, and the ways in which they challenge each other to write different things. And all of Emily Henry's books are just wonderful. Another author I've read lots from this year is Tom Mead. This is Cabaret Macabre, which is the 3rd book in his Joseph Spector Locked Room mystery series. This year I read The Murder Wheel, which is book 2, and Cabaret Macabre, which is book 3, and I also reread Death and the Conjurer, which is book 1, and I am partway through rereading The Murder Wheel at the moment. There's one day left of 2024 to go when I'm filming this, so I might just about finish it by the end of the year, but if I finish it in January, that's fine. Regardless, I've been reading lots of Tom Mead's books this year. He writes historical mysteries, locked room mysteries set in the 1930s, and I just really, really love this series. They're really, really good fun, with a lot of, like, puzzles within them, and I just quite enjoy a locked room mystery and all the kind of, like, clever logic behind it, and the 1930s setting is really fun. Joseph Spector is a really fun detective character. He is a former conjurer, so he knows a lot about illusions and magic tricks and therefore is good at solving locked room mysteries, and he works with this detective called Inspector Flint, who's a great recurring character too. The recurring characters and the individual mysteries are just great, and I've just been loving this series a lot this year. Then this year I also read and absolutely loved 2 books by Laura Shepperson, The Heroines and The Heir of Venus. The Heroines is a retelling of the Phaedra myth, although there is so much else going on here, and it's such a wonderfully told story with such powerful characters and such great character developments. And The Heir of Venus is both about the Trojan War and the aftermath of the Trojan War, and it's another really, really powerful novel. I just love the way Laura Shepperson writes. Her books are really compulsive and enjoyable, and I just loved her books this year. I still have so many more favourite books to tell you about. So first I have 5 books, which are my favourite sort of like non-historical fiction novels of the year. I read a lot of historical fiction. That's probably the main thing I read other than classics, and I love historical novels a lot, but I have also read some truly wonderful things this year that aren't historical fiction. But because I sometimes find it hard to compare and rank the two, I thought I would do a top 5 of my sort of favourite non-historical fiction reads of the year, and then a top 10 of my favourite historical fiction reads of the year. So we'll start off with the non-historical books. I want to call them contemporary books, but one of them is science fiction, so that is not true at all. At number 5, I have Strange Sally Diamond by Liz Nugent. This is a crime novel, and it is intensely distressing and very, very upsetting. Like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this to everyone. It's very grim and intense, but it is such a fantastic novel, and it's so incredibly well written, and the characterization is just fantastic. I don't want to tell you too much about it because I kind of feel like you should go in not knowing too much about it, but I might leave some trigger warnings down in the description because it is also so upsetting a book that I feel like you maybe should be warned if you want to be warned, if that makes sense. But basically, this novel is about a woman called Sally Diamond. She's in her 40s. She's never sort of fitted into society. She's lived with her father for a long time. She doesn't like to talk to people. And at the very beginning of the book, her father dies. After her father's death, people start to interfere with Sally as a person more, and things start to come out about her past and why Sally might be the way that she is. And it's just an incredible novel, like one of the best works of characterization I've ever read, with also some fantastic sort of crime novel thriller elements to it. And I just thought it was amazing. Another wonderful crime thriller book I read this year was this. This is Then Things Went Dark by B. Fitzgerald. This is a fantastic, incredibly addictive thriller set on a reality TV show. So these 6 horrible, toxic people have been put on an island together, and things get very dark very quickly, and it's just very, very good. And I love the way this book is structured, because we know from the very beginning that one of the characters, one of the contestants, Reese, is going to die, but we don't know whether his death was an accident or a murder, and if it was a murder, we don't know who killed him. So we have a few chapters with the police in the present day kind of trying to work out what happened, but most of the chapters are the TV show itself and various episodes of the TV show, and the kind of social media response to the TV show at the time. And we watch as things slowly get more and more twisted in the relationships between these characters on this island. It's just such an addictive, gripping book. Like, I feel like it's absolutely the book to read if you're like in a reading slump or something like that, because it's just so compulsive and so cleverly done. If you are a reader who doesn't like unlikable characters, you're probably not going to get on with this, because everyone is kind of awful, but also there are moments where you feel sorry for several of them in a really sort of impactful way that is sort of a twist in almost in itself, and it's just really good. So I just highly recommend this. What a wonderful book. Another absolute favourite of 2024 was Home by Katie Steed. This is a fantastic novel about a person called Zoe who was brought up in a cult. Many years later, she has escaped the cult. She's living her life, but someone from the cult has come back to see her, to tell her that her sister, who she thought had escaped from the cult many years ago, has come back to the cult. And so Zoe has to return to the cult to try and rescue her sister. And in this book, we alternate chapters between Zoe in the present and Zoe in the past, and look at her childhood as well as her current self. And it's such an incredibly powerful novel. I feel like Katie Steed has just done such a clever job with the characterization in this novel. I love the way they write, and throughout this book, there's just so many tense, incredibly immersive moments, and the ending is incredible, and I just love this book so much. So I really, really recommend Home by Katie Steed. What a fantastic novel. And then my favourite 2 books of the year, well, my favourite 2 books that aren't historical novels of the year, although would they be my favourite 2 books of the year anyway? I don't know. I was really struggling over which to put at number 1 and which to put at number 2. To be honest, basically these 2 books and the top one of the historical fiction novels of the year, I just couldn't pick which one of them was my absolute favourite book of the year, which I think is partly one of the reasons why I decided to separate out my historical and non-historical books. Does this matter? Anyway, no. Let's say in second place, but maybe in first place, who knows, is The Mars House by Natasha Pulley. This is an incredible novel. This is a work of science fiction set several centuries in the future, when Earth is increasingly in climate crisis. A lot of the Earth is underwater, and we are following January, who is a refugee who is sent from Earth to Mars. On Mars there is a colony. There's been one for many, many years, and the people who've lived on Mars for a long time, who were born on Mars, they've developed slightly differently. They're sort of all taller and physically weaker than the people from Earth. January, as an Earth stronger, is very much sort of in the underclass of Mars society, and he's considered to be dangerous because he is physically stronger than the people who were born on Mars. That's the background of this book. That's not even the premise of this book. The premise of this book revolves around a politically convenient arranged marriage between January and a key political figure within Mars society. And there's so much else going on in this book. Like, I don't even know how I would begin to explain the complexities and subtleties and nuances and amazing themes within this novel. It is such a powerful, incredible novel, and the reading experience was just utterly amazing, as it always is with Natasha Pulley. Like, she's one of my absolute favourite authors. I love her books so much. I just loved every second of it, as I always do when I read a book by Natasha Pulley. So yes, really interesting book, well worth your time. But I think my favourite book of the year in any genre, probably, was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which I feel is not a, unique opinion. This book has got so much praise and so much hype, but I really genuinely think it is all well deserved. I loved Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow so much. I thought it was such an incredible novel about friendship, about growing up, about creativity, and so much more. This is a book about three friends, Sam and Sadie and Mark. We follow them over many, many years as they work together to found a video game company. There's so much I love about Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I don't even know where to start. It is such an emotional, engaging, wonderful read, and it's genuinely one of those books I would recommend to everybody that I kind of think everybody would like. Because it is a book that has received a lot of hype, I will talk about two things within it that I don't think get talked about very much. One is the character of Marks, who was absolutely my favourite character in the book. I feel like I hear so many people say that Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is a book about the friendship between Sam and Sadie, but like, Marks is so important. And I also feel like the representation of disability and chronic pain was so good. Sam was in a car crash as a child, and he has a lot of problems with his foot, has problems walking, and the way those problems change a lot over the course of his life and impact his life, sometimes a lot and sometimes a little. Like, I just thought that was so well done. And overall, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow was just so good. It was just so good. I just cried so much through the whole last section of the book. Sometimes because it was sad, but sometimes because I was just really emotionally attached to everyone in that novel, and I will just think about that book forever. When I was pulling out books from my shelves for my favourite books of the year video, I realised just how many of my favourite books of the year I got from the library or listened to on audiobook and don't have physical copies of. So I feel like I need to go out and buy a physical copy of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow so it can live on my shelves and I can look at it and think about how much I love it, because what a book. What a book. Yes, this video has been going on for a long time, and yes, I do still have 10 wonderful works of historical fiction to tell you about, so let's go. I have ranked my top 10 of historical fiction books, but the ranking is pretty loose until we get to number 1, which is supreme. So, at number 10, I have put The Fraud by Zadie Smith. I don't think this book will be for everyone. I don't necessarily think it's a perfect book, but my goodness, did I have a good time with it. The Fraud is set in the Victorian period, and we're following a lot of different characters, chiefly a older woman who is living and working as a housekeeper for her cousin, William Harrison Ainsworth, who was a real historical figure and novelist. And our protagonist kind of becomes obsessed with a particular trial that is taking place at the moment that she's reading about in the papers, the Tichborne case, which again was a real historical event where somebody claimed to be the long-lost, presumed dead heir to a baronetcy. And we're following lots of different plot strands and lots of different characters from 19th century England to 19th century Jamaica, from the 1830s to the 1870s. If you love Victorian literature and Victorian history, I think you will find a lot to love in The Fraud, because it plays with a lot of Victorian tropes, Victorian ideas, dismantles a lot of Victorian ideas in a really interesting way, and I think it also explores the legacy of empire and the slave trade, and kind of how within every Victorian English story there is also a lot of imperialism that may at first seem hidden. And it's just a really clever, wild ride of a book that I really, really enjoyed. Another work of historical fiction I read and loved in 2024 was Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson. This novel is set in 19th century Scotland and is about the Highland clearances and their legacy, and is also about a kind of slightly later in life love story between two people. It's also a novel about memory and identity and so much more, and I just thought it was really, really powerful, as well as having a lot of really interesting themes. So I really recommend Music in the Dark. I thought it was a wonderful book. Another favourite work of historical fiction that I read this year was Learn by Heart by Emma Donoghue. This is the story of two teenage girls at boarding school falling in love, as well as looking at the impact of that relationship on one of the girls later on in life. The two girls in this novel are real historical figures, Eliza Rain and Anne Lister, and I do think that I love this book a lot more because I have read Anne Lister's diaries and know a lot about Anne Lister as a person, and so that really enriched my reading of this book. But regardless, I did think this was a fantastic novel with really interesting characterization, a really clever kind of central relationship, and a really interesting look memory and growing up. Eliza is so well drawn and powerful in this book, as is Anne Lister, and the look at memory and growing up and kind of the impact that certain events within your childhood can have on you, I just thought was really well done. So I really, really recommend this book. I thought it was great. Another work of historical fiction I loved this year was The Revels by Stacey Thomas. This book is set in mid-17th century England amongst the witch trials. And we're following a young man who has some kind of supernatural ability, who fears that he may be a witch, or that some people would consider him a witch, and he ends up, through various circumstances, being apprenticed to a witchfinder who was very famous many decades ago, but who now feels very, very complicatedly and regrets a lot of his actions from the past. I thought this book was so fascinating. I feel like there are many, many books about witch trials out there, and I often find them interesting, but I feel like this is one of the most interesting, partly because it takes a look at like particular unique perspectives, and I think it looks a lot at both what it might have been like to be someone accused of witchcraft, but also the psyche behind the people who did the accusing, and all the very complicated reasons why accusations were made. The characterization and the writing are just fantastic in this book, and it's really one I would recommend. And I also had to mention The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters. What a wonderful book this was. This is a really eerie, intense novel set in the late 1940s, and our narrator is a local doctor who is called into the local manor house, this big, grand, crumbling house, in order to see to one of the servants. This big, crumbling house is inhabited by a mother and her two grown-up children, and they can't really afford to keep this old place going anymore. We're in the 1940s now, and the gentry is sort of falling apart. And this book follows Dr. Faraday as he comes to know this family more, and also to hear more about the strange, potentially haunting things happening at this house. And it's really intense and really clever, and the way your thoughts about various things and various characters changes over the course of the book is really well done, and I just love it. I just think it's really, really great. Sarah Waters is such a fantastic writer, and I love this book so much. And then at number 5, I have The Great Divide by Cristina Henriquez. This book came out earlier in 2024 and is fantastic. And this book is set in the early 20th century in Panama and looks at the building of the Panama Canal. This book follows a lot of characters who are all kind of connected by the building of the Panama Canal and how that affected people in Panama at the time. I just thought this book was fantastic, with such interesting characterization and themes, and it's just one of those books that will stay with me for a long time. At number 4, I have A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Owen. This is a truly wonderful novel set in the Regency period, in which we're following a young widow who, after the death of her husband, who she was pushed to marry by her family, she meets again the young man who she was in love with many years ago, who she rejected in order to marry her husband, who has just passed away. So you might be able to tell from that setup that there is a little bit of a persuasion retelling element going on in here, but there's also a lot of other things going on. Eliza wants to be an artist, and that element of the book is fantastic, as is her friendship with her cousin who lives with her. There's also Lord Melville and his sister, who are just such wonderful characters. I love Lord Melville so much. A Lady's Guide to Scandal is one of those books that has the exact perfect balance between a lot of really, really interesting themes and great character development and like a really fun love story. It's such a joy. If you are someone who enjoys the Regency period, who loves Jane Austen, then I think you will love A Lady's Guide to Scandal, and I just loved it so much. And it was also one of those books that I feel like I read at exactly the right time, in like a week when I was really stressed and work was really busy, and it was just such an utter delight and joy to read. Just pure joy in novel form. So I really, really recommend A Lady's Guide to Scandal. What a fantastic book that was. At number 3, I have Midnight at Malabar House by Vaseem Khan. This is a wonderful historical mystery book, the first in a series, which I'm really looking forward to reading on with. This book is set in 1950, and we're following Persis, who is the first female detective in the Indian police force, and she's called in to solve a murder when an English diplomat is found murdered at a New Year's Eve party. His murder seems to be connected in some way with events that took place during partition a few years ago, and we follow Persis as she tries to solve this murder. This book is such a wonderful novel. On the one hand, it's a real kind of like Agatha Christie style murder mystery in all the best ways, but it also is a really fantastic historical murder mystery. One of those historical mysteries I love because the murder mystery itself is great, but the murder mystery is also very, very bound up with history and the particular point in time that this book is set. and that I just thought was so well done. The characterization is great, and Vasim Khan is such a wonderful writer, and I can't wait to read more from him in the future and to carry on with this series. At number 2, I have The Square of Sevens by Laura Shepherd Robinson. This was such a fantastic, wonderful, wild ride of a work of historical fiction. I feel like this is a book that you will love if you love Fingersmith by Sarah Waters, though I think I might even go so far as to say that I think it's better than Fingersmith, which is very high praise. In The Square of Sevens, we follow a young woman called Red. A lot of the book is her sort of coming of age story, her growing up with her father on the road. He was a fortune teller, how she tries after his death to find out more about her mother's family, and how this leads her into all sorts of complicated, messy, dramatic things. Meanwhile, we're also following a man called Lazarus Dark, what a great name, who is trying to help one side in a legal dispute about who gets an inheritance. It's both very much a book about inheritance law and also such a dramatic, pacey, riveting read, and I just loved the twists and turns of the plot. There was one twist that I guessed and I thought I was very, very clever until I realised that like that was just the tip of the iceberg, and it was so good. It was so good, and it was so fun as well, like just such a wonderful adventure of a book, as well as being historically fascinating. And yeah, this is the first book I've read by Laura Shepherd Robinson, and I can't wait to read more. I thought The Square of Sevens was fantastic. But my favourite work of historical fiction of the year, and possibly my favourite book of the year, although possibly that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I don't know. Did I say earlier that Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is my favourite book of the year? I don't know. Maybe I did. Maybe it's The Mars House. But one of my favourite books of the year, possibly my favourite book of the year, is Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. This is a truly fantastic, wonderful work of historical fiction that I don't think will be for everyone. It's quite experimental, but goodness was it for me. And it basically tells the story of Durham and Durham Cathedral from the Anglo-Saxon period, from the death of St Cuthbert and his legacy, moving through various time periods along the way. The book plays a lot with form. There's diary form, there's play script, there's sections that read more like poetry than prose. There are chapters that are all made up of different lines from different primary and secondary historical sources. Like, it's totally wild, but it's so good. It was one of those works of historical fiction that was both a work of historical fiction, you know, a work of fiction set in the past, but also a book about history. Like, so much of Cuddy is about history and how we make history and how people tell stories and how stories turn into history, and what history is. And I just loved that about it. But also it was such a wonderful emotional read. Like, I was so invested in every single section within the book, and the last section just had me like crying so much. I do think I was especially emotionally invested in Cuddy as a novel because it's set in Durham and it's about Durham Cathedral, and I went to university there and I know the cathedral and Palace Green like really well. That definitely did increase my investment in the book. But regardless of that sort of personal connection, I also just thought it was such a wonderful, incredible work of historical fiction, and I cannot recommend it enough. Like, it was so good. It was so good. It was so good. Like Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, I got Cuddy out the library, and I definitely should have bought a copy and will buy a copy soon because I love it so much and I want to have it upon my shelf to look at and reread at some point in the future. It was so good. Anyway, this video has been quite long enough by now. Those were some of my absolute favourite books of 2024. I will have a favourite classics video coming up very soon. Do let me know down in the comments, have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? What were your favourite books of 2024? I always love watching people's favourite books of the year videos and hearing what other people's highlights of a year were, and these were some of mine. So that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.